Okay, so we're going to talk about why in my practice we have switched from using the GI map, which we had used for many, many years. I've run hundreds and hundreds of GI maps, but we have switched from the GI map to different types of stool testing. And I made the switch because I just knew something was missing, and I'll get into it in more detail. And I'm very glad that I've made the switch. I'm loving these new stool tests. We're using various different kinds, depends where you are in the world, depends on your budget, depends what's going on with you with symptoms. There's a lot of different ones that we utilize now. And I love that because, this is functional medicine. There's no one size fits all. So now we have these options which are proving to be really helpful. We're already seeing the benefits of utilizing these new stool tests in practice. So we're going to get into it. And I think the best way to start out is by talking about the different types of technology, but we're not going to get into the weeds. We're not going to get super technical on all this because that's not really what I like to do. And I'm sure it's not really what you want to hear about either. But it's important to understand the different types of testing. So we've got culture-based testing and DNA. And the culture-based testing, it came around in the 1800s. It was revolutionary at that time, allowed us to culture these bacteria to see what was going on with these bacteria to a certain degree. But it was limited and is limited. Whilst there are still some labs utilizing it today, and there are some good reasons to utilize it, it does miss a lot of bacteria. My mentor was saying up to 90% of bacteria can be missed, which is very problematic. There are other issues with it. Temperature will really impact your sample, and that's a problem because we're trying to get these samples on airplanes or transportation and to and from the lab, and so that's a bit of an issue. But also it's time consuming to culture a bacteria, got to wait for it to grow. And the medium that you use, some bacteria will favor that and will love it and thrive on it and grow a lot, whereas others may not. So it can be a little bit tricky in terms of what you can see when you're culturing bacteria. It also can't quantify some of the key players of bacteria. So these are things like Faecalibacterium or Akkermansia. These are the keystone strains of bacteria that we need to know are robust in the gut because they have so many health properties and they're very powerfully anti-inflammatory. And, the problem with this is we must be able to see our butyrate levels in the gut. That's a powerfully anti-inflammatory short-chain fatty acid because without knowing the butyrate levels, without knowing what the butyrate producing bacteria are doing in the gut, we can't manipulate that and grow those bacteria to elevate that butyrate to decrease inflammation. And this is absolutely imperative. You're not able to determine if somebody's gut is healthy or not without seeing these types of bacteria. So definitely not accurate for microbes, according to a mentor of mine. It is accurate, however, for intestinal markers. And these are things like calprotectin, which is a marker for inflammation, secretory IgA, which is an immune marker, and other types of intestinal markers. And these can be quite important markers. We do like these markers. Now, from culture-based testing, we moved on to DNA testing. And so this was in the early 2000s, the DNA testing came about, and it was a much more complete, much more accurate picture of the microbiome, because we were able to see species that weren't able to be cultured in a lab with the culture-based technology. So very exciting. This type of technology also isn't as impacted by environmental factors. So your sample is more stable as it's transported back to the lab, which is fantastic. It's more reliable in this way and not as impacted by temperature because we're looking at the DNA of organisms. We're actually looking at dead bacteria. My cat's trying to climb a fence outside. If you're watching me on video, that's what I'm looking at. I don't know what she's doing. That doesn't look good. Oh, well. So the GI map is DNA testing, and there are a few different kinds of DNA testing, and it's important that we talk about what those different kinds of DNA testing is. I might have to rescue my cat. We're just going to pause this. No, she's all right. She's all right. So there are a few different kinds of DNA testing. So we've got 16 srRNA sequencing, and this actually focuses on one specific gene, the 16 srRNA gene, and it gives us what we call genus level information. Again, we're not going to get into the weeds. If you look at the taxonomy of bacteria, you're going to see that it's not just, a lot of people for example, go to a health food store or the supermarket and they just grab a probiotic and they don't realize that we've got this whole taxonomy of bacteria. It starts with phylum. And I've got to read it out here because I never remember this. So phylum is like the top dog of the bacteria kingdom. And then under the phylum comes class, and then we've got order, then we've got family, then we've got genus, then we've got species, and then we've got strain. And so it's even the strain level data, more so than the species level data, that truly, truly matters. So you're going to the supermarket or a health food store and you're grabbing a probiotic off the shelf and you're only looking at maybe the species. So maybe you're just getting a lactobacillus, but you don't know what strain you're getting. There's multiple different strains, and these strains have been studied for various different things. You might be using something thinking it's going to support you because it's a lactobacillus or a bifidobacterium or whatever the case may be, but it's not doing the thing you want it to do because you haven't got the right strain that has been studied to support when it comes to that particular symptom you're trying to resolve. So that's really important to understand, that the strain level really, really matters. Let me see here. I was talking about that because the 16S rRNA gives us genus level data. And so it's good for assessing what we call the relative abundance in the microbiome, how much of each type of bacteria is present, but it's not good for drilling down to the species level of bacteria, which is really important, as I just said. And it's also not good for identifying virus and fungi and parasites. Well, it doesn't detect these things. So that's another limitation of the 16S rRNA sequencing. Then we have got, and remember, these are all the DNA stool testing. Then we've got the shotgun metagenomic sequencing. So this is the gold standard of DNA testing. It can identify bacteria, fungi, virus, parasites, and it can drill down to the species and the strain level. So remember, it's genus, species, strain. So fantastic. We can see so much incredible data. We can also see, which is huge, these metabolites in the gut. So this is absolutely invaluable information when it comes to determining why you might be experiencing certain symptoms. It could be brain fog. It doesn't have to be GI symptoms, but it could be bloating, it could be gas, it could be smelly gas, it could be constipation, diarrhea, brain fog, mood issues, you name it. The gut really impacts every single system in the body, but you need to know what these metabolites are. Absolutely imperative information. These metabolites are, so we'll get into it a little bit now. So the metabolites would include things like hydrogen sulfide is one example. And so hydrogen sulfide, you don't want it to be too high, but you also don't want it to be too low, because either way is going to be detrimental for your health in a multitude of different ways. Another metabolite is methane. So if you've got a lot of methane, you may well, let's say that you're bloating a lot, let's say you've got constipation, you probably do have a lot of methane in your gut, which is being made by bacteria. And this metabolite of methane is the end product after these bacteria are eating certain things, and then they're making this metabolite. So that's why we need to see the metabolites. There are more metabolites, but there are a couple of examples. If we don't have that information, the GI map doesn't give us that information, we're kind of running blind. We don't know why you're struggling with your constipation or your bloating or your brain fog or your energy issues, whatever the case may be. But if we see these metabolites, we then can look at the bacteria that make the metabolites, and then we can manipulate the microbiome with herbs and prebiotics and probiotics to bring down the certain bacteria that produce these metabolites that are too high in your gut. Or we might need to boost certain bacteria that are too low, and you're not getting the short chain fatty acids I spoke about, of which butyrate is the most important, because butyrate is anti-inflammatory. But you need to boost those butyrate producing bacteria, the ones that when you feed them, they produce the butyrate. You need to make sure they're nice and robust so that you're making enough butyrate. So this is the kind of information we desperately need in order to get somebody feeling better. And it's not just about feeling better, it's about longevity, because gut health, when it's optimal, really supports your longevity in a multitude of ways. Mitochondrial support, supports your mitochondria, your inflammation levels. That's huge. As midlife women, and as we continue to age, we continue to get inflamed. And the gut is the most important area of attention when it comes to reducing our inflammation in the body. So we've then got the PCR, polymerase chain reaction technology, and this is often used for pathogen detection. Now, this is the GI map. So whilst it is useful for identifying certain specific harmful bacteria, we can also see viruses and parasites and candida, things like this. It doesn't give us a complete picture of the gut microbiome. And this is why we switched, because with the GI map, it gives you it basically makes you think about killing things. So you're being given a very small amount of bacteria. There's not a lot of bacteria that you're shown on the GI map, but that bacteria makes up your microbial ecosystem. And that bacteria, it makes or breaks you and how you feel and your longevity. So, like I said before, we need to know what those bacteria are doing so we can manipulate them and bring them back into balance, because it's that balance, it's that balancing of the microbiome and these bacteria that ultimately get you well and healthy. How can you do that if you can't see all those bacteria? If you've got I think it's like 9 bacteria on the GI map, that you can see with the commensals, you need to see a lot more of the ecosystem to really get a good feel for what's going on, what you need to grow, what you need to pull down, and then the metabolites as well that the GI map doesn't show you. So the GI map, it's more of this pathogen killing approach I was finding. And, it's not that I was just finding that, it's very much a North American way of working. A lot of my training comes out of North America, not all of it, especially with this microbiome. I'm currently finalizing an advanced certification with a researcher and clinician who actually is located in Tasmania. But when it comes to the North American approach, it is very much more of this kill, kill, kill approach. And maybe that's because a lot of people are using the GI map and it gets you in that mindset. What can I see on here that I can go after and kill? Instead, what is a healthier way to work with the gut is, what can I see on this test that I can cultivate, that I can grow, and what might be a little bit overgrown that I can bring down in a more subtle way, not hitting it over the head. So we hit things over the head with the GI map with things like oil of oregano or berberine or some really harsh antimicrobials, which can have a lot of collateral damage in the gut. So, and when I say collateral damage, I mean these antimicrobials can kill off some of those commensals, those good bacteria. And then you're going to have this dysbiosis continue, this dysbiosis, which is that imbalance of the good and bad bacteria. If you're not manipulating that terrain in a more gentle way, bringing in the prebiotics, bringing in the probiotics, some little dietary switches and changes, then you might be chasing your tail and going around and around in circles because you're only looking at what you can kill. So I've already given you a few reasons why we switched. The GI map doesn't give us that broad picture of the microbiome. It gives us the limited commensal bacteria, yet this is absolutely critical information if you want to support your gut health, improve your gut health. For example, it gives us 1 Bacteroides species, but there are 30. So that's just an example. There are also there's no Desulfur Vibrio or Bilophila wadsworthia on the GI map, but these are key players when it comes to gut health and when it comes to a lot of the symptoms that you may be suffering with. If you have a sulfur metabolism issue, which so many people have this issue, how do you know if you do? Well, you might have really stinky, rotten egg gas farts, a lot of bloating. You have a sulfur metabolism issue in the gut, but there's no way of knowing how to address that when you can't see these 2 bacteria, the Desulfur Vibrio and the Bilophila wadsworthia. So those 2 bacteria in and of themselves are absolutely vital, and you can't see them on the GI map. And then it also doesn't tell us about the metabolites that I've spoken about, the hydrogen sulfide, the methane, the butyrate, etc. They are absolutely critical for assessing and then and then dictating treatment when it comes to improving gut health and overall health. Like I said, it's more of a pathogen-focused test. So we're really getting us into that thinking of let's go out and kill whatever we can find on this test. And that can be dangerous, right? We want to, instead of the killing approach, again, I'm going to reiterate it, we want to restore, we want to nourish, we want to nurture our ecosystem, not go in with a shotgun and just, or I don't know, what is that one? I can't ever do noises, mouth noises. the machine gun. We don't want to take a machine gun to the gut and kill off all these things because all the good guys get killed off as well. So what a better approach to go in and go, okay, well, you're a little too elevated. Sometimes what we can do, because you might be thinking, well, what if you've got a bacteria that is too elevated, that is like Klebsiella or strep or something else, Bilophila wadsworthia, Drosophila vibrio. What if these bacteria are too elevated? Don't you need to bring things in to kill them? Yes and no. Sometimes we bring in herbals, but we do them in tincture format because the oil of oregano, for example, in a capsule is not the best way. It's going to do more damage. So tincture formats are much more gentle on the microbiome. So we might bring in a herbal tincture and we might bring that in for a little while, but we also can utilize food. Food is so underrated when it comes to what it can do to the microbiome. For example, fat. So many people are eating gobs and gobs of fat. And whilst fat is wonderful and important, the pendulum has swung from low fat in the 80s and 90s to super high fat in recent times. But this is doing a lot of damage. It's doing a lot of damage to our microbiomes. When you eat a lot of, in particular, saturated fat, so think coconut products, coconut oil, coconut milks, dairy fats, and yes, meat fats, animal fats. When we eat a lot of saturated fat, such as a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet, or just somebody trying to get all that protein in that we talk about ad nauseum, that's very important, but they forget about the produce along the way. All that saturated fat is very damaging to the microbiome and can, for example, feed Drosophila vibrio and feed Bilophila wadsworthia. And then you're going to feed these guys up, and then they're going to make these metabolites like the hydrogen sulfide, which is going to then eventually, in time, cause you issues and cause you symptoms. So we can manipulate the diet, reduce the saturated fat. We can take other things out of the diet, but also, like, for example, sulfates and sulfites. We're not talking about a restrictive approach here. We're talking about what can we bring in? Cranberries or pomegranates or matcha green tea or red currant powder. There's so many different foods that we utilize with our clients that we bring in for our clients to eat. But then, we might suggest to them, try to get your fat down a little bit, because we can see things, metabolites and bacteria on these new tests that are telling us they're gobbling up the fat. And you might be wondering why. Well, let's take Bilophila wadsworthia as an example. Think about the name, Bilophila, bile. So when you eat fat, you produce bile. Bilophila wadsworthia loves to eat bile. So you're eating all this fat, you're producing all this bile, and the Bilophila is just sitting there gobbling it all up and growing and growing and growing. And then bang, you're getting metabolites that are damaging you, your overall health, your microbiome. So there's a lot we can do with diet. Yes, sometimes we pull in some antimicrobial tinctures, but we gently do that. But we utilize a lot of prebiotics. We utilize probiotics as well, but we also utilize a lot of prebiotics. There's a lot of different kinds. We've got to be very careful in the individual, what they're dealing with, what they can tolerate. But when you bring in these probiotics and the prebiotics, they do wonderful things to the pH of your gut, which can overall support the beneficial bacteria and reduce the bad bacteria. There's so many wonderful things these pre and probiotics can do. So that's kind of how we manipulate the microbiome in a more gentle way, not in a kill way. So the other thing with the GI map was H. pylori. According to my mentor, his words, not mine, it's a very unreliable marker. However, I have seen this clinically. One of the reasons I was interested in learning a different approach and utilizing different stool tests in my practice was because we would get back these GI maps, and every single person usually would have H. pylori show up. And that was a red flag to me. It didn't make sense. I was like, this can't be what's going on here. Not everybody, like if we got a GI map back and somebody did not have H. pylori, we would, I'm talking about we, Michelle and I, my team practitioner, Michelle, we would be messaging each other. Oh my gosh, yeah, they don't have H. pylori, because it was such a regular occurrence for these ladies to have H. pylori. Well, it turns out that this H. pylori marker is probably too sensitive and is probably producing a lot of false positives. So, my mentor was talking about how he'd get these results in, but then he'd go and do other types of H. pylori testing, and 9 times out of 10, the H. pylori was not there. So take that for what it's worth. But I was very skeptical after a while. I was like, this doesn't make sense, doesn't add up. There's also the reference ranges are questionable. These are not my words. I'm not a researcher. It's coming from the research and it's coming from my mentor. So, reference ranges don't correlate with a lot of research. So that's a little bit concerning. And there's some concerns about the reliability of some of the intestinal markers, particularly calprotectin. What I've learned, that this can be raised when it's actually normal. I've seen this clinically. This actually happened to me, and then it happened to another 2 clients of mine. And so I'll quickly tell you my story. So I did a GI map many years ago, and my calprotectin was really high. We're talking Crohn's disease high, and or cancer sort of high. Like, this was quite alarming. Now, I had 0 GI symptoms, so it didn't make a lot of sense, and my intuition was telling me, "You're fine," but I wasn't about to not get that checked out. And I'm a big believer in colonoscopies because my grandfather, who I never met, died of bowel cancer, and my stepmom died of bowel cancer, which probably could have been prevented, or at least she would probably still be alive today if she had had a colonoscopy earlier on. So I'm a big believer in them. So my doctor and I decided, yeah, get me a colonoscopy, and I went and got one. Perfect gut, all clear. I went into the doctor's office after the colonoscopy, and she puts her hand on the keyboard and she turns to me and she says, "Right, tell me all your symptoms." And she looks back to the computer as if I'm going to rattle off a huge amount of symptoms. And I said to her, "That's the thing. I don't have any." She's like, "Wow." She said to me, "I was sure we were going to find Crohn's when we went in there." And she found nothing. And we got to talking, and I said to her, "You know what? I did have a little bit of diarrhea around the time I did the test. And I remember that because I never get diarrhea. And I remember even saying to my husband, 'Oh my gosh, I had some diarrhea because it's so abnormal for me.'" And she said, "Well, that's what it will be." And she was saying how sometimes loose stools or diarrhea can falsely elevate calprotectin, because as I understand it, calprotectin is more of a lower bowel marker for inflammation. It is not a slam dunk. You can never just look at calprotectin and it's normal and say you've got no inflammation. You just can't do that. Just the same as you can't look at a high sensitivity C-reactive protein and it's in a good range and determine that there's no inflammation. You just can't do that. It's just not the way it goes. But so we determined it was the loose stools, right? And sure enough, I did another test back down into the great reference range. And then I had a couple of clients, same thing. They had loose stools. They ran the GI map, calprotectin through the roof. Of course, I said to them, "You should talk to your doctor and get that checked and get another test done. But it's probably just the loose stools." Sure enough, they did another test, calprotectin back down. So keep that in mind. I don't know if that's the same mechanism by which my mentor talks about calprotectin being unreliable. Maybe this is different, but that was just my experience with calprotectin. Okay, so that is, hopefully I have explained my reasoning for why we switched. And so far we're loving it. We're loving the switch. I have actually had a lot of people ask me a question about the biome testing. So I'm going to just quickly touch on that before we end this episode. So the biome testing, it keeps coming up, and it is the shotgun technology. So just to reiterate, there's 3 types of the DNA testing. So we've got 16S rRNA sequencing, the shotgun sequencing, and the PCR. So you've got 3 different types. And so the shotgun is really good. And so whilst the biome is shotgun, it doesn't give you the full data set. So what you're going to be getting with the biome is a list of what to eat, and you're going to get a few species. Very, very unhelpful. So one of the tests we use is about 40 pages. You need data, and you need a clinician who can interpret that data, who has training on that data when it comes to the species, when it comes to the metabolites. So you need that data to be able to do anything to support your gut. So just getting a list of what to eat, or not to eat, and just a few species, it's not going to help you. So that was to answer that question, get the good quality data. And there's a lot of different tests out there. So I'm not going to go into all the different tests that we use, because we do use a lot of different ones. So I really hope that was interesting. I hope it wasn't sort of too technical, and I hope it answered some of your questions. But if you have questions, you can absolutely come over to me on Instagram. I am there. You can come into my DMs. You can ask me questions there. More than happy to answer them for you. I am at Thorne Health. And that's it for now. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please share this out with any of your friends or family members who you think might actually benefit from this information. Head to the show notes, because you're going to find some links in the show notes that might point you in the right direction. Okay, thanks for listening, and we'll speak again soon. Bye for now. I am not a medical professional, and the information provided in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. I do not have access to your individual medical history or circumstances, so the content discussed here should not be considered as medical advice. Before making any changes to your diet, lifestyle, or considering the use of supplements, please consult with a qualified healthcare professional or your doctor to ensure it's safe and appropriate for your specific situation. Any decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are at your own discretion and risk. Thank you for tuning in.